2023, Nigeria had an election that was one of the most keenly contested elections in the history of the country. Some people say it left the country sharply divided between those who faulted the conduct of the elections, saying it left a lot to be desired, and those who disagree. Over 2 years after, and with a few months to the start of campaigns for the 2027 elections, how much has changed on the electoral landscape of Nigeria? Are we better now than then? Have we learned any lessons from the past that can guide us to a better future? Tonight, we sit with the Executive Director of YAGA Africa to look at these and other issues. Hello and welcome to Newsnight.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I would like to go straight from the top, and let me start from the general before I come to where is your own forte. 2 years into the administration of President Bola Tinubu, what will be your midterm assessment?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag for a lot of reasons. First, if you're going to assess the president and his administration, you need to first look at what promises did he make and whether he's fulfilling that promise. But secondly, is to what extent is he able to fulfill the constitutional duty of providing for the welfare and the security of the Nigerian people. Yes, undoubtedly, the president has taken some bold actions, whether it's the removal of fuel subsidy, whether it's the flotation of the naira, or whether he's kickstarting or looking at how other sectors can contribute to our GDP. So you give it to him, he's taking those actions. We've also seen him appoint, ministers that are providing some stellar leadership, whether it's in the aviation sector, or he's in youth development, or in the interior minister who is doing brilliantly well. You see that across board that the president has appointed or did appoint people who are delivering, some dividends. So you give it to him. He's also led some very remarkable reforms around local governments, or devolution or strengthening of local governments with the legal case that was instituted at the Supreme Court, granting, financial autonomy to local government. So to a large extent, we have seen some progress on that front. So that's undeniable. However, you also need to look at where are certain drawbacks. So if you look at what's the impact of some of these decisions on, Nigerians, you clearly see that Nigerians are grappling with all forms of economic hardship. Some of these decisions have brought untold hardship. Mm-hmm. We've also not seen commensurate understanding and also shift in the lifestyle of public officials. So on one part, the state is asking citizens to understand, to cut down and shift in sort of their priorities. But we don't see that on the part of the state. The state is still expending a lot of resources for certain frivolities. If you look at the budget and look at how much is budgeted for upkeep of certain public officials, you ask yourself the question, there is a mismatch between what we hear and also what is action. If you also look at security, Nigerians are sleeping with one eye closed in several parts of the country. Look at Benue, look at Plateau, look at Taraba, look at Zamfara, look at Ikoro. You see that the country is grappling with those intractable problems of insecurity, whether it's in Borno State. So you see all of these also happen, and you really wonder whether the government is fulfilling its responsibility of providing security for the vast majority of Nigerians. On the aspect that deals with, rule of law, yes, whilst to a large extent you see the president talks about the need for the state authorities to protect and defend the rights of citizens, especially the right to express dissent, we have also seen, a clampdown on the rights of citizens, whether they are the rights to protest or a restriction or curtailment of the rights of free speech. We see that also happen within the current dispensation. So it's a mixed bag. Yes, there are some positive steps that have been taken, but Nigerians are still clamoring for governance that, one, does not bring untold hardship to the people, one that makes them feel safe and secure in their country, but also one that projects prosperity.
What's your position for those who say that it appears, yes, we're doing a midterm review for the president, but that it appears we put all the issues on his back without appreciating the levels of governance, so like the governors and all that. So what's your own take when we look at some of these issues and the roles governors play in this?
Well, your question was, what's the presidency, the administration? Because if we look at the subnational entities and the state, I dare say that, yes, there's a short supply of quality governance at the state. And that's really disappointing. There are very few governors that you can point and say they're really performing and delivering on the promise of democracy at the state level. Instead, what you see is governors who are so empowered, but yet are doing little for their people. And yes, we are a federation.
Yes.
Powers are shared between different component units of the federation. So when you look at this collectively, you ask yourself the question, are governors really delivering, on some of their promises? There are some governors who are delivering, but there are some, when you go to the state, you just see an absolute collapse of governance at the state. So the country cannot record remarkable progress if you don't have efficient and transparent leadership at the state. It's the same thing when you look at the other institutions of government, because governmental powers are shared between the executive, the legislature. When you look at the state legislature across the entire country, can you really say that there's effective legislative governance? Because most of the state houses of assemblies cannot limit the excesses of the exercise of executive powers at the states. A lot of them are subject to the whims and caprices of their governors. So even though the Constitution grants them legislative autonomy or independence, it is really far from the expectation and the desired outcomes of those laws.
Your position is interesting. Recently, we celebrated Democracy Day, a time to mark and look at the democratic health status of the country. We celebrated 26 years of
democratic expedition
and then of uninterrupted democracy. What you're saying now comes to the heart of it, and it looks like on one hand, while we can celebrate that we have had such a good long run, we still have a lot to do when it comes to understanding how these structures run. What do you think we should do? Because that issue you mentioned as regards even the issue of legislative, it looks like there's non-existent in the state, like you said. What can be done?
So first, the question about our 26 years of democracy, I think that it is worth underscoring that we should celebrate the fact that we've experienced uninterrupted democracy in the last 26 years. It is something we shouldn't take for granted, that we had successive elections, even though they have variations in their quality and the integrity of the outcomes, but the fact that we've seen transitions, from one administration to the other, in fact, from an opposition actually trumped and removed the incumbent, attests to the durability of our democratic experience. So we need to recognize that.
Okay.
The second point is that whilst there are limitations to the exercise of freedom as at today, you cannot compare our experience today with a military experience. They are just at parallels, and no one should draw any comparison whatsoever with a military dictatorship and a democratic process. So that's that. But when you look at this broadly, you ask yourself, after 26 years of democratic expedition, have we evolved with a democratic culture? Have we produced more Democrats? And I say no. We have evolved in our process, but what we have done is to produce more plutocrats or produce more authoritarians who are masking as Democrats. Because if that's not the case, the kind of assault that you see at the poor governors across the country wouldn't have been the case. Today, you see people who are vested with political power and political authority use that as instruments of oppression on their people. You think about the entire political space. Just look at the whole concept of elections. And you look at the quality of elections, and when we prepare for elections over the last 26 years, it appears we are going for war. Why? Because the political actors come to elections as a war and a do-or-die affair. The kinds of atrocities that politicians commit just because they want to seek political power leaves us really questioning whether we really want this democracy. When you look at our political parties, for instance, you look at all the parties with the deficiencies that you're all grappling with, it simply tells you that you don't have Democrats. You just have individuals who want power at all costs, not to use it to advance our collective interests and our will, but to simply use it to perpetuate themselves in office, enrich themselves, and use that to fight inter-elite wars. And that has been our story in the last 26 years.
Do you feel 26 years we've gotten, we the people understand what democracy is? Do you think we have an understanding? Because a lot of you're talking now, you mentioned political actors and the institutions, but the people themselves, do you think the people have an understanding of what this democracy is?
Do you know what the people understand? The people have been socialized to think that when you go to elections and you vote for leaders, you give them power to hold in trust for you. You give them authority to solve the problems. And there's a problems of access to quality healthcare. There's a problem of what? Access to quality food, quality lifestyle, quality education. It's about security. It's about freedom. Democracy can only make a meaning if all of these material benefits, including political freedom, is guaranteed. What we have seen, it's not that democracy has made Nigerians poorer than they used to be. No, it is not democracy. It's the political leaders who are beneficiaries of a democratic process that have refused to use the opportunity that they have to advance the common good. Instead, they have used it to enrich themselves at the expense of the people. They have refused to provide quality leadership. But democracy also has a self-correcting mechanism. And this is where the National Assembly and the state houses of assembly have power to keep the executive in check. But they cannot keep the executive in check if they themselves subject themselves to what? To the authority of the executive. When you become a rubber stamp legislature, when you cannot perform quality oversight on the executive, and all you do is pandering to the executive at all times, making all sorts of statements to say everything the executive brings, we will pass it without any form of scrutiny. What you do is you make it difficult for citizens to believe in democracy because that's not what they are taught. So when we say, do citizens understand democracy? What is there to understand about democracy if democracy is not safeguarding their rights to free speech? If democracy is one that ensures that journalists are incarcerated and intimidated when they expose corruption or they hold political leaders or ask difficult questions, what then is democracy? So these are the questions citizens are asking. But when you think about whether we know whether citizens understand democracy and what you're saying, understanding the ethos and the principles of democracy, I dare say that what social media and media has done, and traditional media has done in the last 26 years, it has expanded the frontiers of political socialization. And so citizens have access to more information. We often underestimate the knowledge that citizens have at the grassroots level. And that is why at the local government level, they're asking questions about how come we don't have elections, but people are appointed, and as simple as fixing drainages, as simple as paying the salaries of what? Of teachers is becoming a challenge and a difficulty. The FCT where we are, there are several protests that teachers and staff of FCT are not paid their salaries, and they are protesting. And then you talk about democracy. Democracy can only make a meaning if the livelihoods of people is improved. But it's not just about their material benefits. There is also the concept of freedom. that they are able to ask questions at the right time without any fear of reprisal or any fear of intimidation.
I think that's a place I'm trying to come to, because the role of democracy for the citizens also means they are the ones who check. Yes, the institutions, these roles that the police, the court, the media play, but the people, have they picked up the mantle? Over the 26 years, have they understood and gotten enriched with the tradition of democracy? I think that's what I'm
Absolutely. I think we're not where we want to be, but we need to give citizens credit.
Okay.
Because there have been several policies that the government wanted to shove down the minds and the necks of citizens, but they've opposed it. It is here in this same country, we've seen when the National Assembly tried to pass the draconian counter-subversion bill, or even the recent case where they wanted to pass a compulsory voting bill. Citizens spoke, put pressure on the National Assembly, and the Speaker of the House of Reps responded by withdrawing those particular legislations. That is democracy at play. Democracy was also at play in the 2023 elections. There were governors who thought they were emperors and they could win elections at all costs. They wanted to come to the Senate, but the people said no. They voted for other candidates other than those governors. So you see that post the elections, yes, there's diversity in the number of political parties, but down the line, 2 years down the line, where are we? Most of those actors have cross-carpeted to the ruling party. So the level, when you go online and see how citizens are asking questions, asking their political leaders questions, that's democracy at play. So we need to see more of that, especially around the fact that citizens need to understand that the local government is the closest government to you. Now you need to hold your local government chairman to account, places where there have been elections, or even your councillors. They are your representatives, so you need to ask them those difficult questions. But also seeing citizens challenge different actions in court. We've seen strategic litigation, whether by civil society or by different organizations, challenging actions of government. So to a large extent, we're seeing the signs of emancipation, if you call it, but we need to do more. And this is why political socialization is important. Unfortunately, political parties have failed in their responsibility of advancing civic education. But we need to do more. So civil society and media have served as that bulwark and that vanguard, and perhaps even a buffer, where political parties have failed in their responsibility of orientating, of educating citizens about their constitutional rights, how to enforce it, and the role that they play in a democracy.
And that may explain why it appears we have a large, at least at the grassroots, it looks like the play, like some of the examples you gave now, happen more within the city center. But the area, the grassroots where, or the local governments or the villages where some people feel the votes come from, they may not be getting this education, as you say.
Well, there's need for more. But one of the sort of narrative that we need to propagate is that democracy is not about elections. We see a mobilization of citizens around elections.
Yes.
You would see activation, whether it's community association or age groups or, community-based associations, very active during the elections.
Yes.
But post-elections, they are not active in asking their leaders how far have they performed.
Or monitoring the process.
Right, in delivering on their campaign promises.
Yes.
For instance, at Yaga Africa, we host what we call people's assemblies, which is a deliberative democracy tool, which we experimented in places like Lagos and Sokoto and in 12 other states across the country, where we mobilize citizens at the local government level to meet with their elected representative and take decisions on certain public policy matters. Now, we've seen where local governments have taken actions in providing healthcare centers, in fixing roads, ensuring that street lights are functioning because of that engagement between citizens and their elected representatives at the local government level. We need to see more of that. In fact, We also host what we call constituency outreach engagements, where we take National Assembly members to go to their constituencies, to meet with their constituency, to give account, of their stewardship and their leadership. And I say that give it to some members of the National Assembly. They've been very, very proactive in articulating what they have done and how it impacts on their people at their constituency level. And that's what we need to see more of that if we want democracy to deliver, or if we want citizens to not limit their understanding and their participation in a democratic process to elections, because democracy is more than elections.
So let me quickly have your view. I know you touched on it. Some have, and I think you did too, you critiqued the relationship, the way the National Assembly and the executive, the president, is working. What would you love to see?
I'd love to see a National Assembly that is bold, that is courageous, to provide the necessary oversight to limit and checkmate the excesses of the executive.
And you think this present set?
I think that this present National Assembly, especially the Senate, has done a poor job in holding the executive to account. The House of Reps, compared to the Senate, has really demonstrated it has courage around several issues, whether it's around appointments, whether it's around budgets, around several public policy issues. We see a courageous House of Reps compared to the Senate. And we need, what Nigerians are saying is not a National Assembly that fights with the executive.
Yeah, but they've always said that. Is it that Nigerians want them to be at their...
I think it's an oversimplification and trivialization of the whole concept of checks and balances. When you hear public leaders at that level trivialize the whole concept of accountability. Democracy is about accountability. There's a reason why the National Assembly exists. It exists to make laws, to perform oversight, and do what? And represent the people. You cannot be a National Assembly that does not keep the executive in check. Where the executive acts outside their powers, you have to put them in check. So holding them to account is in public interest. It's in public interest. That's why you have checks and balances and separation of powers. Sometimes you don't know what is the fundamental difference between a section of the National Assembly and the executive. And that's really unfortunate, for our democratic process. And I think that the executive has gotten away with a lot of things because of the character and the nature of the National Assembly. And that needs to stop. This whole thing where you pass a legislation in one day without public scrutiny, it's unacceptable. In a democracy, no. Some legislations that fast. You can pass loan request that quick. Why have you not passed other public interest legislations like the Electoral Act, like the Constitution? Why is it taking so much time? Even when elections are just about 505 days to the 2027 elections. We need to do that. Why is it that the National Assembly is not scrutinizing appointments being made to INEC with a high degree of due diligence? Why do we have people who we know in public space have campaigned, for political parties, appointed as commissioners in INEC? Those are the issues. There is a reason why the framers of our Constitution separated those powers and said that appointments into INEC and other federal executive bodies shall be subject to confirmation of the Senate. The whole essence is for the Senate to do what? To check, to perform due diligence, so that unqualified persons, people who do not command trust and confidence of the people, don't make it. But when they fail in that responsibility, you have the executive have its way at the end of the day. And what do you get? Is a broken trust on the part of people. And you cannot have democratic legitimacy if people don't trust the process.
Unfortunately, would you say this is becoming our tradition now? Because it looks like this trajectory of partnership between the National Assembly and the executive appears to be falling into this role right now?
No, now, listen. Separation of powers does not mean separation of government. It is one government, the APC administration. There's that concept. So there's a place for partnership.
Yes.
But it is partnership that does what? That defends and protects public interest, and not the interest of the executive.
Or the president.
Or the president. I say the executive because it's a composite. The president has transferred certain powers to his ministers and they are executing on his behalf. But all of them hold trust for the Nigerian people. And so partnership is part of governance. Don't get me wrong. But within that, there's also checks and balances. That if the executives make a proposal that advances a particular interest and not the collective interest, what's the National Assembly role? Is to ensure that they put the executive in check to say, no, we need to check how this advances the collective interest of the people.
Okay, so we'll continue our look at our democracy, but right now, I'd like us to go straight to elections, and which is a vital part of our democracy, because it gives us a chance to also check if we want somebody, we don't want someone, we can remove. And that's also a statement on our assessment of his role. We had a very interesting, I don't want to use the word contentious, we had a very interesting election in 2023. Post that election, 2 years down the line, how would you say we've moved forward in addressing some of the issues that came up in that election?
So let me shock you. Well, I don't think this will shock you, but you're also a Nigerian. That every Nigerian knows that we've not moved forward with our elections since 2023. That we've had by-elections, we've had off-cycle elections since 2023. And I say it's been a downward spiral, disappointingly so. In fact, in some of the instances, the 2023 election was even better than some of the off-cycle elections. Because what we saw in the subsequent elections was a complete erosion of the whole concept of integrity in all those elections.
Please,
and let me break this down.
Yes.
The only election that post 2023 that we can say meets the integrity test is the Ondo election. The Edo election, the Imo election, the Kogi election, all of them failed to meet the integrity test.
What do you
This
think?
is based on the assessment of election observers, including Yaga Africa. Because what you saw is a high degree of election manipulation. One, in places like Kogi, we saw pre-filled result sheets. We didn't see that in the 2023 elections. What we saw, and we mentioned this, that we are seeing a reversal of all the gains that we've made since 2015 till date. We're seeing politicians resort to old-fashioned ways of manipulating results. Because pre-filled results made it to the polling unit in the Kogi elections. Yaga Africa Expo, we were actually the first organization that actually put that out. It was there. INEC confirmed it, that they were pre-filled results.
Okay.
In that same election...
But the results were now cancelled.
No, the results were cancelled. In some of those places, elections did not hold because of the margin of lead. But in that same election, even in the court, you also saw how there was overvoting in the election. But the election was not cancelled, even when the total number of registered voters or people who collected their PVCs in those locations where overvoting occurred was higher than the margin of lead. But that election was upheld in court. You come to a place like Edo, where Yaga Africa and other election observers also released their report and say it didn't meet the integrity test. So when you look at the elections down the line, we've just seen a retrogression. So we've not moved forward with our electoral process. And what is really heartbreaking is that this INEC introduced remarkable reforms. The BVAS, the IREV, several innovations that this Electoral Commission introduced, all of them, have been brought to their knees because of the desperation of certain political actors because they want to seek power at all cost. And that is really disappointing, right? And so when you think about our elections and where we are, and we've just issued, our State of Electoral Integrity report, 2 years down, this is the second report that we are releasing. We released the first one and we asked the question, has electoral trust been restored? The answer is no. Afrobarometer, a globally renowned research organization, also has data to show that a majority of Nigerians have lost trust in the electoral process. There have been several polls that have been conducted. And so where we are now is how do we rebuild public trust in the electoral process? One of the things, that keeps us really awake at night at Yiga Africa is, can we rekindle trust or contribute to rebuilding trust and confidence in Nigerians, such that when they go out to cast their vote in the upcoming elections and in the 2023 elections, that they believe that their votes will count, and that even after it counts, that you don't have the courts upturning an election, even though the outcome reflects the will of the people, or we are not going to go to the polling unit on election day, and then the presiding officers will show up with pre-filled result sheets, which is highly condemnable act, and hoping that it doesn't reoccur again within our electoral process. These are some of, the issues within our electoral process.
I'm still going to take you to the report and maybe get to understand some of your findings, but I'm trying to wrap my head around what you say. Part of what past reforms were to do was to address some of these things that you mentioned. Are you saying those legislations, those practices, or some of the what would I call it, rules put in place, failed to check some of these things and still the courts let them through?
Absolutely. And I'll give you 3 instances. In today's Nigeria, we are uncertain about the legal standard for the INEC guidelines. In other words, we don't know what's the position of the law on INEC's guidelines. What's the legality of INEC guidelines, why? On one hand, the Constitution gives INEC the power to make rules and regulations in an election. INEC goes on to issue regulations and guidelines.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Somehow, the courts interpret the law to mean that the guidelines are not part of what? The legal framework for elections, and that any innovation introduced by INEC must be clearly prescribed in the Electoral Act. For heaven's sake, what kind of jurisprudence is that? So we don't know whether the guidelines are a subsidiary legislation, but we know the rule in administrative law that once an institution has been vested with the power to make subsidiary legislations, it's able to make that. So when you say smart card reader, when you say BVAS, when you say IREV needs to be in the Electoral Act, and because it's not there, even if it is contained in the guidelines, it cannot be legally recognized.
And even if it helps to make the elections better.
It's one of the biggest drawbacks in our electoral process. So the legal status of INEC guidelines is a debatable issue. But on one hand, you hear the courts, in some cases, take decisions based on the provisions of INEC guidelines. So you're left wondering, what is the position of the law regarding the legal status of INEC? And that is why INEC is able to escape liability, because of these divergent positions of the law or contradictory positions of the law related to INEC guidelines. The second, issue around this is that some of the reforms introduced are yet to deliver on their outcomes. A classic example is the IREV. The IREV was a brilliant innovation. We call it the game changer. What was it meant to do? it was meant to be used for electronic transmission of results, electronic collation of results, so that it serves as a check on the manual process. But what did we see happen? The Supreme Court has said that IREV is not part of the collation process, right? That it's not part of the collation system. And for it to be legal, it needs to be provided in the law, which really undermines all the effort INEC put in place to ensure that what? To ensure that the result management process, which is the weakest link in our electoral process, is what does not deliver on its objective. So INEC is also culpable in also some of the positions that its lawyers put forward in the course of previous election petitions, where there's debate about what's the entire purpose of the IREF. The third one relates to, when you think about another reform, is this whole reforms related to the BVAS. And the BVAS was a game changer and still is a game changer because it deepened the quality of the accreditation process. But what do we see? We see how politicians continue to encumber on INEC to get them to bypass BVAS. So you've seen in elections where BVAS is not used for accreditation, but the results are not cancelled in those instances. And why is that the case? Because the BVAS is meant to do what? It's meant to sanitize the process of voter accreditation to deepen the credibility of the process. So what politicians have done in the last 2 years is to look at those innovations introduced by INEC to sanitize the process. They went, undermine the entire process, and then make a mess of it. And I think the biggest challenge for us in this reform process is how do we, through the instrumentality of law, protect these technologies because they have the potential of limiting human interference in our electoral process.
Is that something that is being looked at? I know there are reforms going on. Do you think these are things that are being looked at right now?
There are several things that are being looked at, but quite frankly, as you are aware, I am part of the technical committee established by the National Assembly on the electoral amendments. And one issue that has not featured prominently is the demand to make electronic transmission mandatory. Citizens have demanded. In fact, civil society released a citizens' memorandum on electoral reforms that when you think about the top 5 reforms that needs to be made, they are non-negotiable. One of them is mandatory electronic transmission of results. And the whole advocacy is not to replace the manual process with the electronic process, that both of them should go hand in hand so they can serve as a check on each other. But I'd say that electronic transmission, it's not a priority issue in some of the conversations that I have had, with the lawmakers and the legislators. And I think that it's important for citizens to continue to demand that it's electronic transmission or nothing.
I want to find out from you, your research and your team, do we have a problem with INEC as an umpire, considering the level of distrust and the image problem it appears to have right now in elections?
I think if you ask every Nigerian on the street whether they believe and trust, the trust levels in INEC is high, the answer is no. Nigerians don't trust INEC. And you cannot blame Nigerians. And you know why? Before the 2023 elections, the entire country believed in this electoral commission because of the leadership of the commission and the kind of reforms that they introduced. And not just the reforms, because INEC was also consistent in the decisions that it made regarding fundamental issues. So you give it to the Electoral Commission. But when I talk about the commission, I'm not talking about the chairman of the national commissioners, including the resident electoral commissioners. But what did you see happen with the last election and the subsequent elections? It's a gradual erosion. So INEC also bears responsibility for these levels of distrust. INEC has to blame in some cases. But it's also not just about INEC. But the entire electoral governance architecture that has security agencies, that has the judiciary, that has INEC, and it has other actors. And the role is, what are those other actors playing?
And they select the recs.
A classic example, like when you take the Edo elections, and what happened in Edo with the whole collation process? INEC engages academicians, right, to manage the collation process. The fact that someone is a professor or holds a PhD is not guarantee of integrity, as the case in Akwa Ibom has shown, where you have a professor who is being prosecuted, right? And so you see situations where collation officers alter results, steal elections from people. They substitute figures because they've been compromised by politicians. And the question is, what action did INEC take in punishing those same collation officers? It's the same thing about when INEC officials are found wanting. What action does INEC take? Before the elections, there was padding of the voters' register. INEC identified these officials. We've not received any update on what happened to those officials. It's the same thing. So these are some of the things, that happens. But did the commission take some actions? Yes, it took some actions. For instance, with the 3 resident electoral commissioners, the one in Sokoto, who was alleged to be involved in bribery, the one in Adamawa, who usurped the powers of the returning officer and tried to supplant himself as a returning officer, and then the one in Abia. Disciplinary actions were taken by INEC because INEC was also limited by the provisions of the Constitution, because the chairman is not the appointing authority.
Yes.
It is the president, and it's only the appointing authority that can sanction. So the best INEC could do at that material time was to withdraw the delegated powers that they have and ask the recs to stay away from the office. And they wrote to the appointing authority, and now those recs, have been removed, from office. That is a progressive and a bold action taken by INEC. But Nigerians want to see more of these kinds of actions from INEC. And this is why we strongly support the proposal by INEC. In fact, this is the first INEC that is boldly demanding that the powers of appointment should be removed from the president and vested in INEC, because part of INEC's proposal on this reform is that the powers to appoint recs should be vested in INEC, because the IG of police appoints commissioners.
Yes.
Other agencies, you have the heads of those institutions appoint their state's heads. Why is it different in the case of INEC, where the president has to appoint the resident electoral commissioners? Why should the president appoint national commissioners? That's why in the wisdom of late Justice Ways, God bless his soul, and the report was very clear that you need to remove the power of appointing the chairman, the national commissioners, and resident electoral commissioners from what? From the president. Because what you do is you protect the independence of INEC as an institution. So that is where we are. And those are the kind of reforms, that is required. Because if you have an election that is superintended over a politician, do you expect the other actors to trust the outcome? It's not possible. This is why the whole principle of neutrality, of objectivity, are the cardinal foundations of election administration.
With the time left before the election, do you think we have enough time to win people back? We're talking of trust deficit, and we're also talking of this is a situation where we already had low turnout for a lot of elections. You're now saying we've lost trust. Do you think we have enough time to work at it?
Oh, absolutely. We do have a lot of time. And there are 3 actions that I will propose. The first one is that the National Assembly needs to conclude on this amendment process before they proceed on recess. They can do it. The electoral amendment, the recess for July. If the National Assembly can pass a law in one day, within few hours, then they can do that. Because I tell you, Larry, it's also not just, and that's my third point, right, is what we need to change in our electoral laws are not new.
Okay.
They are known. It's the political will to introduce them.
Are you saying we should be looking to them? My understanding is that the law should be the one to enforce compliance.
When you look at the reports from ICPC, from UNODC, right, the level of judicial corruption is very high. Just recently, the NJC suspended how many judges in Imo State? For what? Age falsification. For heaven's sake. People who are vested with the responsibility of dispensing justice, who have to be above board, high levels of integrity, and moral and impeccable character, are the same people who are falsifying their age. You see all forms of judicial misconduct. So that leaves you. So we are just in this what? In this theater where we don't have respect, even the decency to uphold our own constitution. And this is where politicians need to change their attitude. And that's why we continue to call on the president as the head and the leader of this particular government to be a statesman by ensuring that he works with the legislators in the National Assembly to pass the electoral law that does what? That enhances the quality of our electoral process. And it's a legacy issue for him. As someone who prides himself as a Democrat, right, who also contributed remarkably to the discourse on electoral reform, this is a time for him to act as a statesman. This is a time for the National Assembly to act as statesmen and stateswomen, even though they are in short supply,
Yes.
by ensuring that the Electoral Act is passed in record time and all the issues citizens have raised is reflected in the final document. But not just that, but to safeguard the independence of INEC.
Let me take you very quickly on the issue of inclusivity. When we look at, and I know you had pushed some years back, the Not Too Young to Run bill, looking back, how far, how well?
Well, I'd say that for us as a movement, we're quite, impressed with the level of young people who have gone into office, who are beneficiaries of the legislation.
Appointive or elective?
Elective. I mean elective,
No.
right? Elective, remarkably young people at the State Houses of Assembly and the National Assembly. For the first time, we had under 29s who were in State House of Assembly and the House of Reps. We're very excited. We're not where we want to be, but the level of youth representation is still very low in the Legislative House. When you look at appointive, and one thing you must give to the President Tinubu, is that compared to other presidents, he's appointed more young people into appointive offices, right? So you can give that to him and whether these young people are performing, but it's also in very strategic positions. And we commend him for doing that. But we have a long way to go. But inclusivity is not just about young people. It's also about women. And I dare say that the level of women representation is abysmally poor. I thought that the president would have appointed more women, but then you have the reserve seats bill being considered in the National Assembly. If the president and the National Assembly want to demonstrate to Nigerians that they care about inclusion, the reserve seats bill should be a top priority that should be passed at the National Assembly as well as the State Houses of Assemblies. It's the same thing for persons with disability. The representation is also very poor in public office. And as a country, if we care about inclusion, we need to protect the rights of citizens to vote by passing the early voting bill. We need to pass the reserve seats bill, but we also need to introduce quotas in political parties so that young people, women and persons with disabilities stand a chance of even securing party nomination before getting into the general elections.
I think that's a very good place to leave it. Thank you so much, Sam.
Thanks.
Very good.
Always a delight to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Have a nice time.
Thank you.
Well, a lot to take from that interview, and I really want to have your views on some of his positions. Are you optimistic about the coming elections? What is your view about the Independent National Electoral Commission? And what more can citizens do to ensure credible elections in Nigeria? Please send in your views to our social media handles and the email address here on the screen. That is our discussion this week. Thanks for being there. Bye.